it occurred to me that, in this present economic crisis, we might ought to think, well, back to the period of the time I wrote about in the Battle of Vicksburg, we think we have it bad. Look at those poor sods. They were living on mule meat and eating rats and living in caves and stuff, and these were Americans. I mean, they were serious Americans. Then it occurred to me, this is tax day. But they still had it worse than we do. But, before I get into that, and I haven't had a whole lot of time to rehearse here. I thought I was going to have all day to write, not write a speech, but make a speech. And what I wound up doing, because they told me now I got to be on all these TV shows today and carried me around all over Atlanta, all I got in the way of a speech is these notes, and they ain't much. But I'll try to get through it. I mean, Atlanta, when I came here for the first time, I was in college. And Atlanta was what New York City was to people in Pittsburgh or something. I mean, man, it was the real deal. But I look today, now, my publisher has got me set up in a place called a mansion on Peachtree Street, which is one of the most pretentious names I ever heard, but it lives up to the reputation. I mean, let me tell you, I got waked up this morning at 8 o'clock or 7:30 or something by a knock on the door by a lady who spoke a foreign language. She wanted to clean up my room. And I said, what is it? I mean, I've been out at this Bones restaurant all night with my friends. And here I am at 8 o'clock in the morning. She said, well, your signs are. I said, what signs? She said, this. And apparently you punch a button inside your room and a big electric sign comes up and said, clean up room. Then they got a TV set in there that is a painting. I mean, it's on the wall. It's above the desk, and it's a modern painting. And you have to do like punch a button, and the painting goes up in the wall. And then you punch another button, and the TV set goes on. Well, of course, I don't know that, so I got to call the engineers to come and tell me about all that. And then I discovered something truly remarkable. They got mirrors in the bathroom that make you look 20 pounds lighter than you are. I'm not kidding you. I mean, it's weird, but what a cruel thing to do when you have to go back home and discover the truth. So, I mean, I'm staying at this place, and I mean, I'm telling you, I went in the lobby today, and there's a man there that either is or looks exactly like Mr. Netanyahu from the country of Israel. He's sitting there by himself on a couch. And I started to go over and introduce myself, and I said, no, I'll not do that. I don't know whether it was or not, but it sure looked like it. So it's a fancy place, and Atlanta did not use, I mean, the Hyatt House was the fanciest place that they had here when I used to come to Atlanta. But I am so glad to be back tonight to talk about the Battle of Vicksburg, which I'm sure all of you are fascinated with. And if you aren't, you're fixing to start. When I was in high school, I had a history teacher. I'm sure every one of you had the same history teacher. This guy was named Doug Barfield. He wound up being a football coach for Auburn, which is all right. I went to university, but it doesn't matter. He said, well, what was it, when was it, and why was it important? So let's try to answer that question. Well, Vicksburg in the Civil War was an enormous Confederate fortress along the Mississippi River about midway between Memphis and New Orleans that was important because it reared up about 200 feet on big bluffs out of the river, which is the size of a 20-story building from 5 or 6 miles, bristling with Confederate guns, and it foreclosed the opportunity of the people in the Middle West up there, Iowa and Chicago and all those places out in the Midwest to ship their hogs and timber and all the products that they depended on for their economy down the river and out through the Gulf of Mexico and sell them overseas. That was one reason it was important. Second reason it was important was because the Confederate Army then controlled that stretch of river so that they could have what Abraham Lincoln called the hog and the hominy coming from Texas and Arkansas and those parts of Louisiana and Oklahoma and other Confederate alliance states over in the West to supply to the armies that were fighting in the East and then also in the West. So this was recognized actually first by Abraham Lincoln, who got a conference going. I guess it was called a conference then, but whatever it was between his military people and some naval people and several of his cabinet, and he said Vicksburg is the key. If we can take Vicksburg, everything else will fall into place in the West. And when he said in the West, he meant the Western Theater of Operations as opposed to the Eastern Theater of Operations. He's quite correct. The Vicksburg is holding everything up. There was no way to get a commercial boat past there because the batteries would blow it into matchsticks. Another person to realize this just about the same time as Abraham Lincoln recognized it was U.S. Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, who was a moderately disgraced Union officer who had been, so they say, and I have no proof of this, and neither does anybody else, but it's probably a good guess, forced to resign from the Army for drunkenness. He had gone to West Point where his scholarship was questionable. He graduated in the lower part of his class, but his equestrianship was superb. He was the best equestrian they ever had at West Point. But he found himself in a lonely, miserable fort out in Northern California, up around the Oregon border, and he commenced drinking. And the result was that one day his commanding officer said, well, I don't know what he said, but let's just say he said this, Captain Grant, you're either going to have to resign, I'm going to court-martial you, and Captain Grant resigned. And went back and failed at everything he did. He failed at being a farmer. He was married to into a wealthy family, and they gave him land to farm, but he couldn't get that going. And he wound up cutting firewood for a living, and then he became a real estate agent for a while and couldn't do that very well, and wound up working at his daddy's store. His daddy was a tanner, meaning that he had a business where they slaughtered animals and made skin out of them for shoes and various other things. And he couldn't even do that. And then the war came along, and he applied to join the Union Army again, and it was turned down, principally because of his reputation as being a drunkard. And finally, the governor of Illinois either took pity or in desperation hired Grant, made him a colonel just in the Illinois militia, which had nothing to do with the United States Army, but hired him to try to put together some semblance of a military unit out of a bunch of chicken thieves in 2 regiments that they had. They are volunteers who were causing a lot of trouble just by being there. And Grant whipped these guys together, and he found himself, he had 2 regiments. Well, all of a sudden, they gave him another regiment because he'd done well. Well, then these 3 regiments, he just about got him a division. Well, a division, well, not a division, I beg your pardon, a brigade. And a brigade means that you get to be a brigadier general. So sooner or later, here comes this commission for U.S. Grant as a brigadier general, and he took his men down in a couple of fights. He lost both of them, but they were basically in the nature of raids. They weren't big fights.